Okay, so now we're going to be taking a look at the UI as it pertains to animation. Now 3D Studio Max has a lot of options for dealing with time, and we're going to be covering a few of these right off the bat, but more of them will expose themselves and make themselves known as we deal more and more with animation. So what we have here, in the lower right hand corner, are some very common buttons. You can see these buttons on just about any sort of media player, whether it be a VHS, DVD, or Blu-ray player. You even find them on CD players and so forth. And these respond in much the same way. So what we have is we have our play button right in the middle. And as you'll notice, it's looping the animation. We also have the capability of jumping forward and back a single frame at a time. We also have the ability of jumping to the beginning of the animation or the end of the animation. Now the hotkeys for these particular features, the less than sign on the keyboard goes back a frame. The greater than sign goes forward a frame. The / animates. Pressing home on the keyboard goes to the beginning. Pressing end on the keyboard goes to the end. Now, as we're playing this back, you'll notice that we have this bar moving across the bottom of our screen. This is the time slider. This tells us exactly where we are at any point in time. And so if I pause this, we can see that we are currently at frame 99, which is actually mirrored right down here. Now, if you remember from our previous discussion, animation is just basically a series of frames. Those frames show slight variations of the object over time, and then when those frames are played back in sequence, we end up getting the illusion of motion. And so that's exactly what we have right down here. We have 100 frames to work with. And we are currently at frame 99. If we wanted to go to, say, frame 20, we can just type it in and be done with it. Now, in addition to these controls over here on the right-hand side, we can actually manipulate the time slider itself. So if we click and drag on the time slider, we can scrub through our animation. And this scrubbing behavior is very useful when testing and tweaking animations. Because say, for example, we're not happy with this sphere's impact. We can just scrub back and forth right around the point of impact to try to figure out what doesn't look right. In addition to this, we can click on the little arrows, or we can click on the empty space above our frame indicators down here at the bottom. Okay, so we have a couple different ways of navigating through time here. Now, as I play this back, we're seeing the frame rate come through. So every animation has a frame rate, basically how many frames make up a single second of animation. By default, we're roughly at about 30 frames per second. So what we're seeing here with 100 frames is just over 3 seconds of animation. And if we count it out, you'll see that it's exactly that. Now, one thing to be careful of is you'll notice in my viewport here, I have the statistics enabled. And the frames per second is hovering around 400. This is completely separate from what we're dealing with in terms of animation. This is basically how quickly our graphics card is drawing the current scene. It's not how quickly the objects are moving through the scene or how quickly it is playing back frames. Okay? So those are two very different things. Try to keep them separate, even though the same term is often applied to both. Okay, now, as mentioned, our frames per second is set at roughly 30 frames per second. Say we want to change this, or say we want to change how to display the frames per second. We can do this using our time configuration option, which is directly to the right of where we enter our frames. So if we click on that, you can see that we have a series of options here for how 3D Studio Max interprets time and how it displays that time. So first off, we have our frame rate. This frame rate, as mentioned before, is basically how many frames make up a single second of animation. So NTSC is 29.97 frames per second. NTSC is very common in US standard television, although that is likely going to change as all the stations start switching over to digital formats. PAL is 25 frames per second. Film is 24 frames per second. And then we can specify custom to be whatever we want. Now it's important to set this frame rate to whatever your target is going to be. If you're going to be rendering out to film, use the 24 frames per second. If you're going to be rendering out to HD TV, you want to make sure that you set it to the proper hertz. So whether that's 60, 30, or 24 hertz, you typically want to set it to that number. You also want to make sure that when you're compositing things and editing them afterwards, that everything is consistent. You do not want to render as NTSC and then bring it into, like, say, a 30p setup or a 30 frames per second editing solution. The reason for that is what will happen is every once in a while you'll get a small jump as it makes up for that tiny fraction that's missing. Because remember, NTSC is 29.97. It is not quite 30 frames per second. So you want to make sure that you set all this correctly based on your target. Now, in addition to the frame rate, we have various ways of displaying the time. Currently, by default, we are set to frames, which is exactly what we see here, pure frames. We also have, at the bottom of this list, we have minutes, seconds, and ticks. Minutes, seconds, and ticks is a combination of, or basically something that was used heavily by those recording in analog formats. So often audio was done that way. Video was done that way as well. And because things weren't broken down in such discrete elements as frames, as with digital content, you have a very high level of precision, where basically each frame, or each second rather, can be broken down into 1/4800th of a second, which is extremely precise. Above that, we have frame in ticks, which is basically, it's not quite as detailed as minutes, seconds, and ticks, but it does give you a lot of subframe accuracy. And then finally, we have the SMPTE format. And the SMPTE format was created by the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. And it's a great compromise between those doing analog and those doing digital content. Because what they were finding is that the guys doing digital stuff were all dealing with frames, and the guys doing the analog stuff were dealing with typically the minutes, seconds, and ticks. And so synchronizing the two became increasingly more difficult. And so what they came up with was a compromise. And this compromise exists of three components here. The first component is the number of frames. The next component is the number of seconds. And then finally, we have the number of minutes. So as we increase the number of frames here, once we reach our 30, it's just going to increase the number of seconds by 1. And so this makes it very easy to see on our timeline exactly where we are within the entire sequence. Because sometimes for very long animations, it becomes difficult to do the math to figure out exactly how far we have to go or how long a particular movement needs to be. Now, in addition to this, we have such things as our playback rate. If you do not specify real time, it will play every frame of the animation regardless of how long it takes to redraw the screen. The only problem with this is that you will not get a good sense of speed throughout this entire process. So if you're testing speed, I encourage you to keep real time on. If you're not testing speed and you're just testing poses, then you can turn off real time. You can also specify whether you want it to animate in the current viewport or all of the viewports. So if I uncheck that, click OK, and go to all of my viewports and play this back, you can see that it animates in every viewport at the same time. Usually this isn't that helpful, and it's actually just a waste of resources. But there are going to be times when you're going to need to look at an animation from multiple views at the same time. And that's where that becomes useful. And then finally we have loop, basically when it's playing back, whether or not you want to loop it. The one final thing that is very important is the playback speed. If we set our playback speed, say, to half the speed, we go ahead and we play this back. Notice how it's playing back slower. This does not affect how you render it. If you render this out into a movie, it will still render out at its regular speed. So do not use the playback speed to control the speed of your animation. It is just a utility function to help debug in animation. So it helps slow things down so you can see things just a little bit clearer, but it will not affect the final rendering speed. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so we're going to go back to 1. We can also specify how much time we have to work with down here. So you can see that we actually have 4 seconds of animation to work with. If we want more or less, we can just type it in and we're done. Okay, so now let's select one of these spheres. Let's say the sphere on the left. Once we select it, you'll notice there are a bunch of red boxes down here on the timeline. These represent our keyframes. These keyframes are basically key points in time. If you remember from our initial discussion, we act as the director. We tell the computer where the object is going to be at a specific point in time. It will then figure out all the frames in between using some interpolation method that you define. And so as we scrub through here, each of these points represent a key pose in time. And so as you'll notice, we have more keys closer together at impact than we do when it's just moving through the air. Now at any point, we can take these keyframes. So let's say, for example, we have these two moving from there to there. What we can do is we can take one of these and we can move it around. So now it's going to go that entire distance in a single frame as opposed to 5 frames. And we'll be talking more about setting keyframes and moving them around and so forth in a little bit. Just know that we can click and drag over all of these and shift them around. So now the ball's animation starts at a different time. We can also do such things as scaling them or just taking parts of these and spreading them out, doing whatever we want to with them. Now, one thing to pay attention to here is we currently have 2 seconds of animation. If you remember, we actually had a lot more motion going on with this ball right here. It bounced a few more times until it came to a complete rest on the ground. And so what we've done here is we've effectively shrunk our active time segment. Now those keyframes, or those frames of animation for the ball over here on the right, still exist, but we currently do not see them. So 3D Studio Max has a large number of frames that you can work with. I mean, hundreds of thousands. And what we're looking at here now is just like a window into that huge, huge collection of frames. Now we can change this window quite easily through our time configuration option. So within here, we can specify the length. So if we press 4 seconds, you can see that we currently have a lot more frames being viewed from where we were previously at 2 seconds. Or we can decrease it. We can also specify the start time. So if we want more frames before, we can actually go into negative time here. Now be careful with the negative time. Sometimes it's required. Like for example, if you're doing a particle system and you want the particles to start emitting up to a certain point. Otherwise, you may run into problems if you go into the negative keyframes. Some systems, such as the biped animation system, will sometimes encounter problems when dealing with negative times. So just make sure that you're dealing with 0 on, unless you're doing very simple animation or things like particle systems, and you should be just fine. We can also specify the end time, how many frames in general, and so forth. Now there are some very useful hotkeys for those exact same parameters. Say for example, we want to add more time to the end of our timeline here. If we press Control and Alt on the keyboard, click and drag with the right mouse button, and drag on that timeline, you can see that we are adding more time to the end of our sequence. If we click and drag with the left mouse button while still holding the Control and Alt keys, we add to the beginning of our timeline. And if we hold down Control and Alt and click and drag with the middle mouse button, we shift the timeline around. And this really illustrates what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a window into a much larger collection of frames or of time. And so this is just a small window into all the possible time that we can work with. Okay, so that'll basically do it for the user interface as it pertains to animation. Now let's actually get into animating some things ourselves.